Welcome to this webinar on craft editing in DaVinci Resolve. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what this webinar is and what it is not. This is not going to be super deep on a lot of the features because there's so much in DaVinci Resolve that even a in-depth webinar on editorial could take maybe a couple of days. So what I'm going to do is touch on a number of high points, a number of items here and there that I have made note of as I've been working through this sizzle reel that I've been cutting in Resolve 15. I've been making notes as I've been going through it about some of the stuff that I really like, some of the stuff that I don't like, things that I wish that they would fix or change, or some things that maybe could be added here and there. I'm working in the beta Resolve 15, so there are features that may be added since this webinar was recorded, or features that may have been taken away. So that's always worth noting, and it is beta software, so take that for what it's worth. There may be features that I do not understand, or there may be certain things I do not know about. If I had a question, I would refer to, first I would just hunt and peck around to try to figure out the answer. Then I would actually go to the Resolve manual, which is a really, really in-depth user manual. Right now, the version 14 manual, 14.3, is currently the up-to-date manual that is, how long is this thing? 1,300 pages in this PDF. I would often refer to that if I had questions trying to figure something out. And there is also a What's New in Resolve 15 that is a supplement to the 1,300 page manual that has a lot about what has been added in the version 15. If I could not find the answer in the manual, I might search around the internet or ask a couple of questions. But full disclosure, there may be something I do that could be done quicker or that could be done better. But as one who uses multiple NLEs on a regular basis, I think I can find my way around them pretty well, and I always try to figure out the fastest and best method to do stuff. So with that little disclaimer, let's get started. Let's start off by creating a new project. Now I have a project that I've been working on here, and if you are in the project manager, you can see a little thumbnail that can be scrubbed over to get an idea of what's in there. But if I want to create a new project, I hit New Project, and I'm going to call this Numbered Clips. This is some footage that I often use to train with. And when I hit Create, I get an option here that, I don't get an option, I get just my blank new Resolve project with my different tabs at the bottom, or my different pages, if you will. There's the media pool, there's the edit page, there's a fusion page, the color page, the Fairlight page, as well as the deliver page. And if I hold my mouse over there, I'll see the tooltip. I'm not going to concentrate on many of these, mainly just the edit page, because this is about editing in Resolve. Once my project is open, I can go to the project settings, which is an important thing to talk about for a minute. I'm not going to dig too deep into this, but just touch on a few things here. This is a 1080 project at 24 frames per second. I'm going to leave this, even though the media coming in will be different, but I'll leave it that way for a reason there. There's a lot of options here in the settings for different things that we're not going to go through, but I will point out a couple of things here. First, of course, is your resolution frame rate. That's always important, as well as your monitoring. This class or this webinar isn't going to dig deep into things like proxy settings and optimized media and the render caches and all that, but if you do get into that, you set a lot of that here in the master settings. I will go ahead and choose a different thing for optimized media because uncompressed 10-bit, I can't think of why that would ever actually be optimized. I'm not sure why it defaults to that. That seems a bit of an odd choice for optimized media, but I'm going to drop it over onto ProRes. But again, this is not stuff we're going to get into in this particular webinar. Nor am I going to get into much more of these settings in general because there's a lot of stuff in here. I just want to check the master settings for a minute. It shows my timeline resolution and stuff. Now, Resolve is more of a project-based format. It's unlike Premiere when you can have a lot of different timelines that have a lot of different frame rates and resolutions. You set it once on a project basis, and that is what you work at. Okay, and we're at 1080, and I'm going to leave this at 24 frames a second. I'm going to hit Save. Now, when I go to add some media, and I'm going to do this from the media page, not the edit page for now, because I just want to twirl down into my little, got this little drive hooked up here, and I have some numbered clips here. They're called numbered clips. The media page is a place where you can go through and you can audition clips, and you can go in, and if I wanted to add some markers or something like that, I'm going to hit M here to add a marker. But if you notice, it did not add a marker because this media has not yet been imported. It is still on the drive. But if I select all these clips, I can right click and say add into media pool. The clips have a different frame rate than the project, so that's why I left it at 24. You know what? I want to change the project to match my frame rate. So let me hit change, and in that, those clips come. If I go here into my bin, I can see there's my frames per second there. I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to go to my what I call my text specs setting here for my bin, and we'll go over all this a little bit later, but I'm going to load this one up here that shows me these clips are 720. The project was 1080. That's okay because you can mix lots of different frame rates and resolutions in Resolve. You just have to set the base project to a base frame rate and a base resolution, and Resolve will scale these clips up in the timeline as I use them. Now that this is loaded, I could double click here and load up a clip, and then I can hit a marker if I wanted to. There's also a shortcut to add an edit marker, which I've mapped to F3, and that brings a pop-up here where I can actually take the marker and add data about it. I could hit option and drag that out for marker duration. So there's some stuff about markers. We'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later. If I go back in here into my edit page now, there are all those clips that I have loaded up, and I am now ready to edit with them because they have been loaded. If I want to go to work in a timeline, I can do File, New Timeline, and that timeline pops up. I can give it a name, number of tracks, what type of audio I want to have with it, all the usual stuff that you can do with your timeline. Now it says empty timeline here. I'm going to uncheck this, and I'm going to call this numbered clips webinar edit. I'm going to hit create and see what happens here. If you notice, I unchecked the empty timeline option, and all of those clips that were in the bin have now popped up here in the actual timeline itself. Now notice the order in which they're in. There's a sort order here that starts with 12, and it's somewhat random. I'm not even sure what this is sorting by the format tab there. So I don't like that. Let's do that again. Let me delete that timeline there, and let's go ahead and resort them by clip name. And now I'm going to File, New Timeline. That's Command N. So let's just use a keyboard shortcut, Command N. And there's my timeline there. I want to uncheck empty timeline. I'm just going to call this webinar. I'm going to hit OK. I don't really want 4 audio tracks. Let's just put that down to 2. Hit create. And there we go. Look at that. The clips are all still sorted differently. I don't know why or what reasoning it has behind its choosing of how it's sorting those clips, but there you go. So let's say that wasn't how I wanted those clips in. I didn't want that order. That's obviously somewhat out of order. I'm not really sure why. But I can go in here and I can select those clips 1 to 15, right click, and I can say insert selected clips into timeline, and there we go. Easy as that. I've got them back in the order from 1 to 15. Got a little gap there, kind of like Premiere. I can right click that and say ripple delete, and the gap goes away. If I want to add in more media, I don't have to go back to the media page. I can do it from the edit page as well. There's a file, import media option there. Or I could just go out to the Finder and drag and drop in some clips if I so choose. I'll do that with this piece of music here. And I want to double click this piece of music and show you what happens with audio in the source monitor, because it's kind of got a cool view. If I double click that, there is my audio clip, my music clip, and there is a waveform preview. There's a film strip that runs across the top, which is a really quick way to be able to go to a specific piece of the waveform. And then when you hit play, the waveform is going to scroll on the source side. Now you can't click and drag the orange playhead there. It's stationary and it scrolls behind. You of course can scroll the little scrubber at the bottom there, but you can also click and drag it up top there, which is nice. I'm going to mark an in point and out point to mark that entire clip. With Resolve, your track targeting patching happens with this little orange outline. This only is showing audio right now because I don't have any video loaded. This is an audio only clip in the source side. If I was to drag that down to A2, you would see that the source patching changed and this audio clip is going to go to A2. So I can go over here and hit overwrite. You can see you get tool tips, shortcuts there as you move over the different options for the different tools that are available. And if I hit overwrite, that drops that down onto A2. If I did want it on A2, I've got that nice option up arrow shortcut that'll pop that up onto A1. But you can also drag a clip over to the record side. You get a little bit of an overlay there for what you want to do with the clip. But we want to edit with the keyboard because that's so much faster. So I'm just going to put my playhead back up top and hit F10 to overwrite that in. Oops, but I wanted that onto A1. So let's move my patching, overwrite. There we go. Back in the timeline here, I'm going to go over a little bit on just basic trimming type of stuff, but I'm not going to do a whole lot because that could be a whole webinar unto itself. I want to remove these keyframes here, so I'm going to right click and say remove attributes, and you can see you have a selective remove attributes depending on what's applied. Same goes with paste attributes as well. I'm just going to pull all those out of there. These numbered clips are all 30 seconds long, and currently the entire clip is in the timeline. Resolve has three sort of basic modes. The selection mode, there is the trim mode, trim edit mode, and it is the razor edit mode. The razor edit mode is just changes your cursor to a razor, so that's kind of a small mode, I guess, if you will. But what's worth noting here is the different operations that happen depending on the mode you're in. If I am in regular edit mode and I move my playhead over in edit and I click and drag, I'm going to create a gap. Simple as that. In the trim edit mode, it will ripple. This could easily be called the ripple mode because when you're trimming in this mode, you are going to be rippling the result as you make the edit. And you can see here as I'm beginning to trim these clips in, all the other clips before and after are beginning to shuffle because I am rippling them. Actually, it's just the ones that are after they're shuffling because I am rippling the edit and it is affecting the overall duration in the timeline. Since I have rippled these, I can also do a slip and slide because that's what you can also do in the trim edit mode if you're not over the edit point. If I click there, you can see as I start to drag, I am slipping that clip, and there's a 4-up display on the record side to show you what you're slipping, and you can see the media handles that are left as I do that slip edit there. If I move my playhead down toward the bottom of the clip, I can do a slide. Now there's a mode here called dynamic trim mode, and you can hit that by hitting the W key, and that puts you into a yellow playhead. And with that, when you're selected and you then hit the JKL scrubbing, you will actually do a dynamic trim. If I have one side of the edit selected and I dynamic trim, I am in dynamic trim mode. I am rippling that, just like I do if I was clicking and dragging. So it's got a really nice dynamic trimming ability, and you can do asymmetrical trimming, and you can trim multiple edit points at once. If you notice as I go over the dynamic trim, there's a tiny little triangle, a little arrow that pops out right underneath the tool. If you see those, you can right click and there's an option for another item in whatever tool or button that you're hovering over. If I change that to slide, it is now a dynamic trim mode slide. So if I click the clip and I begin to trim, do my JKL scrubbing, I will actually be moving that in a slide instead of an actual slip. The only other place currently that I've seen this little pop-up thing is under the stop button there, and that will let you do a thing called stop and go to last position, which is kind of interesting with that. If you hit play, when I hit stop, the playhead's going to jump right back to where it started from. It's kind of an interesting little option as well. The other thing to understand on how the timeline works coming over from another NLE is the auto select options here. Now if I go under timeline, you can see a lot of different options for keyboard shortcuts for track destinations and locking the tracks and things like that. Auto track selector is a key here. The auto track selector is sort of like when you click A1, V1, V2, A2, A3, say in Premiere and Avid, track-based editor, to turn the tracks on and off. In Resolve, these auto track selectors are how this same type of thing operates. And we can see this by, if I mark an in point to an out point, I've got the auto track selector turned on for video 1 and audio 1. You can see there's a selection there. So when I hit delete, then that is going to delete right away. Undo that, and I turn off auto track selector for audio 1. And when I hit delete or backspace, it is going to leave that behind. So if I undo that and that is turned off and I hit ripple delete, it rippled everything in, but it actually did not ripple delete the stuff out of audio 1 because the auto track selector was off. So get to know the auto track selectors because they are your friends, and get to know those keyboard shortcuts for auto track selectors. Currently they're on the F keys because you'll be turning those on and off quite a lot. Let's dig a little deeper into the trim operations, and I think an easy way to see what all these different trim things are is to just take a simple edit and go through some of them where we see the actual trim command next to the timeline and we see what the outcome of that is. I'm going to take my timeline here with my number of clips. I'm going to grab this other clip that has both audio and video attached, and I'm going to just overwrite that into the timeline. What you can see here is that I have the numbered clips and a piece of audio on A1, whereas with this new clip that I call the Halo ProRes, the audio and video is attached because this clip has actual audio with the video, and you can see that by the little links there that tells me those are linked together. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the thumbnails. So it probably makes this a little bit easier to see. When I go to my thin track height, I can still go ahead and drag the track heights sliders up to make those tracks a little bit bigger. But let's start here and deal with a trimming operation where I'm going to move the playhead a little bit to the left of this edit point. And we will trim to the end, meaning that we will trim from the playhead to the end of the clip. I'm going to go under trim here, and we'll start with something simple called trim end, and watch what happens when I do this. Now, I hit trim end, and I had my auto select turned off, so it only trimmed the video in that point and left a gap behind. Let's undo that. Now notice the undo actually undid me turning on the auto select. Let's undo where we have that back to where we were. Let's turn on my auto select for that particular audio track. Do that again. Trim to end. That's shift bracket. There's a shortcut for that. That trimmed it, left the gap behind. Now that is the same as going to trim, resize, end to playhead. When I do that, I get that same type of result, which is leaving the gap behind. Now, if I go back under here and I say trim, ripple, end to playhead, it's going to shorten the overall timeline, and it's going to cut off this piece of media because I'm rippling the end to the playhead. The overall edit shortened. Watch what happens when I do roll end to playhead. It's a rolling edit where the duration of the actual timeline does not change, but the playhead moves because it rolls to that point where my playhead is. If I turn off auto select and I do that same thing, trim, roll, into playhead, I get a split edit there. So those are the basic trim operations, resize, ripple, and roll, that you will use all the time. Now we also have to take a look at the extend edit, because that's a very useful one as well. That's where when you place your playhead, you can extend an edit right to where the playhead is. But when I hit that, and it's the E key, you can see nothing happened because I did not have an edit selected. That's asking for me to select an edit. So I'm going to select the audio and video there. Just click on the edit itself because our link selection is turned on. When I hit trim, extend edit, that's going to move that edit to the playhead. You can see when I have an edit point selected, Resolve outlines the edit in this green sort of highlight. I don't think this is the easiest thing to see, and I wish it was a bit more, I don't know, maybe easy to see, but that's how it works. That's what we have to work with here. Once that's selected, I could just click and drag here with my mouse. As I drag that, you can see those white outlines showing me how much of a handles I have as I do the trim. As I move that out, when I reach the end of the handle, you can see that green turns to red to show me I can't move any further in that particular trim. Let's put this back here so we have some handles in which we can trim with. Now, selecting an edit is an important thing because that's a big part of some of the commands that Resolve has. If you look here under the trim menu again, there's options to select nearest edit point. You can select the nearest audio and video points, or you can toggle what you have selected as far as the side of the trims. So if I'm Playhead is parked here and I hit V, that's just going to move to the nearest edit point. And then I can hit the U key, and that's going to toggle the trim sides. Resolve also has options that will select a lot of these edit points for you without you having to use the keyboard shortcuts. Back under the trim menu, if you look for the select nearest edit to, you'll see what happens here. Select nearest edit to resize in. When I do that, we see that it selects the next clip, and as I click and drag there, I get a resize edit, because a resize, as we have seen before, will trim and leave a gap behind and not adjust the overall length of the edit itself. Now look here on the timeline here, I have the auto select for audio 1 turned off. If I move my playhead back here and I go trim, select nearest edit to resize out, it is only going to select the video on V1 and not the audio, because that auto select was turned off. So again, Resolve is respecting these auto select indicators. Now how come when if I go trim, select nearest edit to resize in, it selected both the audio and the video in that case? Well, that's because this Halo ProEdge clip has audio and video associated together that are linked together. And that's the difference in those two operations, even though the auto select is turned off. If I go back here and I go trim, select nearest edit, resize out, and I then drag that, we'll see that I get a gap, but the audio is unaffected there. Let me undo that. Let's go back here to trim, select nearest edit to ripple in. When I do that, both of those edits are selected, but our auto select is not selected. So watch what happens when I trim here, and pay special attention to where the audio goes out here, because a ripple operation, as we've talked about, often will resize or retime, change the length of your edit because it's doing a ripple. But as I drag this, watch what happens. It is trimming the clips, but the audio clip is not being moved in time because the auto select is turned off on audio track 1. So as I do that, the length of the overall edit stays the same, but you can see how it made that ripple trim operation. So that's an important thing to understand, is how these auto selects work and how important they are to how Resolve operates. I'm going to undo that, and let's turn that auto select back on and go to trim, select nearest edit, ripple in, and then as I drag that, you can see it's going to do the usually expected or desired behavior, which is shortening that clip and then rippling all the media after it, if we had that media in the timeline itself. Let's undo that. Let's go back up here to my trim menu, select nearest edit to roll, and it just does that. It selects both sides of the edit and then prepares you to be able to do a rolling edit, and with one operation there. Now, I did not mention something that's very important on the resize command. I am here in the, as you see, my regular selection mode of A. If I do a trim, the ripple in again, watch what happens right here as I go into that particular trim. Trim, select nearest edit to ripple in. It changes my edit mode to the trim mode, because that's when all the rippling operations happen. So it has to change that mode because I am going to a ripple trim. That's how Resolve works. Rippling goes into the trim edit mode. Now I could just as easy go back to my regular selection mode. If I went trim, select nearest edit to resize in, then decided, you know what, I want to ripple that, I could just click into my trim edit mode, and then as I drag, there's my ripple edit being performed. I kind of wish that trim edit mode would have a different color trim indicator, so that would let you know what's going to happen when you make a trim versus when you're in selection mode versus when you're in trim mode. I think that could be a nice visual indicator that could possibly be changed in the future. A few feature request updates here in this webinar. Let's talk about dynamic trimming for a bit while we're in our little split screen mode here. I'm going to go back to trim, select nearest edit to ripple in. So I'm on this particular trim that I've set up, and I've seen myself click and drag. But we mentioned the dynamic trim option earlier in the W key that takes us into that particular operation, that particular variation of the trim mode. I'm in my ripple trim now. If I hit W, and I can now use JKL to be able to make my trim. I don't have to click and drag. So if I hit L and start to play, you can see that trim is being made as I play back with the JKL keys. I can trim backwards with J by hitting it twice and double timing, or I could hold down, say, K and L and do a sort of an 8-frame edit, or an 8 frame at a time. I think it's 8 frames at a time, sort of slow motion trim there. That is what dynamic trimming is all about, is using the JKL keys to be able to make that trim without having to click and drag. I'm going to go back to my regular edit mode. If I say trim, select nearest edit to roll, I am still in my regular edit mode, not my trim edit mode, as you can see here. But then if I hit W, that still goes dynamic. My playhead goes yellow, and I can now just use JKL and make those trims there as I am playing back with the JKL keys. It's really a nice way to work if you're not familiar with dynamic trimming. And Resolve's dynamic trimming is it's quite nice, quite robust. They've really worked really hard on it. I'm going to now go out of dynamic trim mode and hit Command-Shift-A on the Mac, and that deselects all of my clips there. There's another interesting thing about the dynamic trim mode. Let's go back under Trim, select nearest edit to roll. I do not have to actually go into the dynamic mode at all to use dynamic trimming. If I hold down the Command key while my edits are selected, as you see here, I can then hit JKL and go ahead and make a dynamic trim without ever actually going into the dynamic trim mode. So that's sort of a temporary way to be able to make that trim. If I sort of see how that works on the ripple side of things, if I go into Trim, select nearest edit to ripple out, that is only my audio selected. So then if I hold down Command and hit J, I am now trimming that back in and shortening the whole entire edit itself dynamically. And the edit on V1 is not selected, but my auto select is turned on, as you see. So it is reflecting that as I make that trim. As I hit L and start to trim back out, it is leaving that gap behind as I dynamically trim that out and make that longer. And I'm doing this by holding down the Command key as I make the trim and not utilizing the W for dynamic mode. But remember, W changes the playhead key, and that goes into dynamic, and I'm now not holding down the Command key as I make that dynamic trim. That's an important one to remember, is the edit selected, hold down the Command key, and you can dynamically trim without entering dynamic trim mode. I've turned my thumbnails back on in the timeline here to make a couple of these other operations here a little bit easier to see. If I go into my trim menu, I've got an option here called Slip Playhead to In and Out. What that will do is, in this case here, if I move my playhead to an even number of my time code burn in there, I'm right here at 1 hour and 7 seconds. What that's going to do is take this frame where my playhead is currently parked, 1 hour 7 seconds, and slip that to be the first frame in the timeline when we cut to this clip 3. So my playhead is parked. I'm going to select the clip. I'm going under Trim, Slip Playhead to In. The clip changed. It was slipped. So now if I go back to the first frame where that clip is cut to, you can see that goes to the 1 hour 7 second mark. You could achieve something similar by going into trim mode and just doing a traditional slip or slide, but that makes it a little bit more simple to get a single certain frame as the first frame that you're going to cut to, or say the last frame as you go out, because there's an option for slip playhead to in and out. It's also worth looking at the nudge keys, and that's one frame left and right versus the multi-frame left and right, depending on what your preferences are set to. If I use the one frame and I am in the selection mode, and I start to nudge the clip, trim, nudge, one frame left, it's going to start sliding that clip a frame left. And I'm going to use my keyboard shortcuts here. As I do that, you can see the clip is starting to slide to the left. If I hit Shift and comma, it goes multi-frame. And I can do the same by moving it back to the right. So that is in selection mode with the nudge. Another particularly useful option when it comes to nudging is what happens when you're in trim mode. When you're in trim mode and you hit the period or the command key to nudge, you are doing a slip nudge. And that's a nice way to be able to just move a clip back a frame or two, but not change where it's positioned in the timeline, because that would be a slide. And again, the shift nudges it multi-frame. How do you change your multi-frame nudge option? Well, that's where your preferences come in. If I go under Resolve Preferences, and I go under my User Preferences, Editing, default fast nudge length is 5 frames. And you can change that to, I like to put mine at 10 frames, save. Then when I do a nudge, it will nudge it 10 frames at a time instead of 5. Another really nice feature under the trim menu is the option for fade in and fade out to playhead. What this will do is it will take your playhead into account and apply a fade that goes from the in or the out edit to the playhead. Look where I have my playhead parked here in the timeline. Just a few frames back from the end of my edit. If I go trim, fade out to playhead, I get fades that are automatically applied with one menu stroke. If I do the same here on a place where there is an edit, say this is not at the end of the particular clip there, if I go here, trim, fade into playhead, it's important to note it doesn't apply a dissolve or anything like that. It just uses the built-in fade handles of the clip to be able to apply that fade from the front of the clip or the back of the clip. If I check my keyboard shortcuts, keyboard mapping, and I type in fade, those options are unmapped, but they can be mapped to a keyboard shortcut, and it's a really fast way to be able to add a fade in or fade out on a clip. Also under the trim menu, if you are working with audio, you can easily and quickly slip the audio a frame or a subframe and forward or reverse, which can be helpful for putting things in sync. And if you're working in 3D, there's an option for slip I. So this trim menu is something we spent a lot of time on, but I think it is an important menu to understand as you go to work doing creative craft editing in Resolve, because you're doing so much trimming, you're doing so much work in the timeline, manipulating your clips to get them just right for your story, that you'll make use of a lot of stuff that goes on under this trim menu. I put some markers on clips before, and you can see that here on clip number 3. If I double click and bring that up, let me resort that there. There are some markers on there, and if I go to my bin here, I can see those markers as well that I have twirled down. I'm going to leave those alone for a minute here and show you a couple things. Those are clip markers. I can add timeline markers. If I don't have a clip selected, when I hit the M key, that adds a marker. I can hit it again, and it will pop open, let me do a modification there, actually make notes and name the marker, and I can give it a duration or a different color. I'm going to not give it a duration, then go back out and hit Option and just drag that marker out, and that gives me a duration there as well. When I hover over it, I see what I titled it. Double click, let's go back in and type it again, add some notes here, hit done, and then you can see those different notes as you move over the marker. You can also see above, that shows up on the record side as well. You see that little dot there? Watch what happens if I don't have any notes in there. I'm going to make this one green. There is no marker data in there, no notes, but if I double click that and I do make some notes, let's just make some random notes here. You see I get that tiny little dot that shows me I've added notes to that particular marker. If I have a clip, I'm going to click it here and I'm going to add a marker on that clip. That adds it back on the clip, and I can see that if I go double click that and I add some data there, and let's also add a duration. Let's make that about 2 seconds, 2:01. I don't see that update in the bin because it's the clip in the timeline is sort of a separate instance from what's in the bin, so I don't get that reflected back on the source side once I add a clip marker in the timeline. It's an important distinction from something like Premiere. If I go back here into, let's load up clip 8, I'm going to add a marker here. And I'm going to name this is called marker 1. Let's just call this 1. I just want to change the name a little bit to something different. Let's add another marker here. And let's call this one 2. And let's give this a duration of 2 seconds there. Actually 2 seconds there. Hit OK. If I go back into the bin, I can twirl that down. And you can see when you add markers to a clip, you get that option as a twirl down in the bin. So if I was to double click the 1, it moves the playhead back to the 1. Actually, let me load up another clip here, then go back and double click the 2. It's going to load that clip, put the playhead on the 2 there. So you can take a look at those markers in a bin view, a list view after they've been created. Now Resolve also has something called flags. Flags are different than markers. Flags work on a per clip basis. Markers work on a per frame basis. So if I go to a clip here in, let's go to 9 in the timeline here, I can go under mark, add flag, yellow, and you can see I get this little yellow flag added to the clip. If I go to my bin here, I've had this flags column up on my bin view, and I can see I added a yellow flag there. If I go here to, let's go to number 11 and go under the pop-up here, I can go, let's add a red flag, and you see how that changed to red there? That tells me that if I go under and use the keyboard shortcut for add flag of G, the current selected color will be added. So if I click 13 and I hit G, that adds a red flag. Now if I go up to my loaded clip in the source monitor, I can't add flags from the source monitor apparently. So that's the thing that you only do in the timeline. That sort of comes from, I think that the flags are probably quite helpful as far as the color page goes, but they may be useful in edit as well. You can see there, I had clip 14 selected and I went under mark, add flag, but it added a second purple flag 13 because that's what was selected in the timeline. So just remember that distinction. Flags are a per clip item added via the timeline, whereas markers are a per frame item that is added on the source side or in the timeline, either to timeline clips or to the timeline itself. Important distinction between flags and markers. There's a couple more things to say about markers worth noting, mainly because they are some stuff that's missing, and I think markers are such an important part of creative editorial that markers need some work, and it's important to note some of the current limitations. If I'm here in my clip in the source side here, if I add a marker, there's a duration there. I can make a duration with a marker by typing as well as by option dragging. But I open that marker, and let's say I want to make that 2 seconds. You might think you just click and on your keypad type 200, enter, and hit return. That did not do anything. Let me try that again. Let's just click in there, 200, return. But that made a super long marker. Now why is that? Well, Resolve does not let you just click and then type in this duration field. It works on a per number basis. So you have to click specifically where you want to begin to type that duration. Let's remove that marker and try that again. Add marker. If I click right there on what would be the seconds, I can go 200, and then that gets me a 2 second duration there. Let me move a little bit further up here. Let's add that again, and let's go 1005 or 02 actually. I typed a 2 instead of a 5. When I hit return there, let's make that one that color. You can see that that actually added that longer duration, but you got to be specific where you type in that duration. I do hope they change that. I don't really like that. I think that doesn't operate like you expect it to, especially if you've been editing with a numeric keypad. But you can have overlapping markers, so that's kind of a nice thing to see there as far as duration goes. Back in the source monitor here, I have a clip which I've put a number of markers on so we can talk about markers a little bit more in depth. It's worth noting that when you place markers, if you want to move between them with a keyboard shortcut, that is not under the mark menu, but that's rather under the playback. And in this case, it would be under the previous and next. It's worth taking a look at these menus, as I may have mentioned before, because there's a lot of stuff underneath them that you need to understand or know about in order to get the most out of Resolve. In our case of our playback, our previous and next for marker is the shift up and down arrow. And this is good to know because if I'm in this source side and I know I have made notes on these particular markers, there's no marker list view tool or anything like that that I've come across really to see all this marker info in one marker type window or tool like Premiere might have. We'll dig on that in a second here, but if I go shift up and down arrow, you can see that I can move from marker to marker, and then I can see some of the data that I have put into these markers pop up in the upper left hand corner there. Now when you are in the Resolve source window there, you can click and drag the little scrubber playhead down here, but be extra careful because this is not very far from the markers themselves. And you see here I have this long purple marker. This is actually a pink marker if I remember correctly. Yeah, that's considered pink. It's very close to that pink marker, and if I'm not watching what I'm doing, I can click and easily grab the marker instead of the playhead scrubber and drag that out of the way to a different spot than where I placed it. So be very, very careful of that. There's also an option to right click and to do things like mark in and outs, and then be able to add markers and things like that as well as create subclips. There's a lot of right clicking things that happen in Resolve, so if you just try right clicking around, you may find some interesting stuff. Let me go down here for a second to the end here where the crew starts walking up. I'm going to mark in to out. And it's a nice thing in here that I can right click and I can say, or I could use the menu up there, say convert in and out duration to marker. And you can see a marker gets added there. And I'm just going to double click that. Or instead of double clicking it, let me just right click and show you that you can go to modify marker. I'm going to make that pink. I'm just going to call that useless and tab that to crew in shot. So that's another way to be able to utilize markers. There's also an option for when you right click, you can say convert the duration marker to an in and out. It doesn't actually remove the marker, but just puts in and out points at the top and bottom of that marker. Now I mentioned that there was no marker tool to see all that data, but if I go back over here into the bin where I have this clip, you can see that I've got this little caret that has been added to my this particular GoPro clip. And when I twirl that caret down, I can then see the markers, the names that I have added to those markers. So I can double click them and it is going to jump the playhead to those markers as a quick way to get some access there. Now you can see I've also put a little bit of data into the actual comments on there, but what I don't see here, oh, there it is, it's under comments. So if you bring up the comments column, and I'm trying to move that over where I can see it, make it a little bit more useful. So if you bring up the comments column, then you're able to have a sort of a marker tool view where you can see all the data that you've inputted about those markers on the source side, which is an important thing to see as you're doing logging. Now let's take that one step further down here to the timeline, where I have also added a whole bunch of markers as well. And you can see as I move my playhead over those, or my cursor over those markers, I get a little pop-up here where I can see exactly what's in those markers. So if I want some type of list view to be able to see and make use of those markers, a place I can do that is in the edit index. The edit index is a place that is an overview of everything that you have in the timeline. In this case, I'm seeing clip names, and if I right click, I have a number of options for the different data that I can see about all those clips that are in there in the timeline. You can create specific column layouts for that, which is very nice. If you go up here under the little three dots for the pop-down menu, there's a lot of data that you can see about the timeline via the timeline index. And one of those options that you can see here is show markers. I'm going to go to show all because I want to see all the different marker colors. And with that, I get myself a little bit of a marker pop-up view where I can see exactly everything that is in those markers. So that makes it a little bit easier to make use of the actual markers in a timeline here. Actually, I'm going to check here because I've got all my markers titled with a title as to what the actual name is. I double click that. You can see that the name in this case is Scrapyard, which is actually not in the right spot. So if I go here, I can actually just drag that marker and move that downstream a little bit and get it actually into the Scrapyard, which is where I need it. But if I go up here, that is the notes. And if I go here and I double click and I add some note data here, besides the name, like this is the scrap yard. I hit OK. You can see there by the notes I get the actual name, and I also get the notes I've added for each marker. And if I want here, I can actually go into Resolve, and I can right click, and I can actually, let's see one thing here. I've got a duration column popped up here. If I actually add a duration to this marker, let's see if we get that identified in the duration column there. We do not. So that duration is not effective to the markers. I just want to check that and see how that worked. But if I like what I have here, let's turn off duration. I can create that column layout and just call that marker data. I'm going to hit OK. Then I have that option to be able to recall that at any given time as a way to be able to see markers in a sort of list view. Now I've turned on all the data in the edit index, and this is a really nice way to be able to jump through and edit and see what all's in there. Now if you're coming over from Final Cut Pro 10, the edit index isn't quite as full featured as what you have in Final Cut 10, but it is a nice addition to Resolve if you're coming in from another NLE, because this is something different that you don't have in Premiere or Media Composer. It's worth exploring all the different options of what you can see in the edit index, and this becomes particularly useful as you're working deep into an edit when you have a lot of stuff like filters and speed effects and things of that nature. You can make good use of all these different things that the edit index can show for you. One thing it can't do is to select multiple clips at a time. It just is a way to move from one part of the edit to the other, as opposed to select lots of things in the edit and then apply many things like filters or something like that to multiple clips. Another thing with markers here, if I'm in the timeline, if I go under my timeline view options here, this is where you can change your actual setup of the timeline and what you're looking at here. Right now, if I zoom out, you can see that I am seeing all the frames of every particular clip. There's an option here to show me only the first frame and last frame of the clip, which is nice. And there's also an option here for a very thin track, a very thin timeline track. But watch what happens when I click this and I go super thin. Hit Shift Z to zoom out. I can no longer actually see the markers that are on any of the clips. That is not good. I still wish I could see each of the markers. But if I go back under here and I start to scale up the track height for the video clips, they'll get just big enough finally where I can actually see the markers in this thinness of the timeline views. I'll also take a second here to talk about audio and scene waveforms. There's an option here to turn on the waveforms, and once I do that, and I'm going to actually make my audio track bigger, I can then see the waveforms. Now in Resolve, they are dynamic and they will scale as I rubber band the volume, so you can get a visual representation of what's happening with your clips. If I add some audio keyframes here, and I then do a little bit of rubber banding, a little bit of mixing, they will also scale as well to give me a visual representation of what I've done here in the on the audio track. I think there's a little bit of wasted space because even at its smallest zoom level, it would be nice to not have, I just wish this would be a lot thinner. I wish I could get a much thinner track here. When I scale this up, there's an option to twirl down here and see the keyframing graph, a much bigger keyframing graph, and that's going to reflect what keyframes you have happening there. Resolve also builds fade handles into each of the clips, both audio and video. So if I go over here, say I've trimmed this in, and I want to fade that out, I can just drag that fade handle in, and that fade handle is already built into the clip itself, which is kind of nice. And if I want to change the slope of that particular fade, that little white dot there lets me just do a quick little drag and to be able to change the slope of that fade. And those things are also available, those fade handles, in video clips as well. And with that, we're going to bring this webinar to a close. This is part one of a two-part webinar on craft editing in DaVinci Resolve. This was originally going to be a one-part webinar, but as I got into it and started working in this particular job, this webinar, as I was recording it, kind of ballooned and got bigger and bigger. There was just a lot of stuff to cover, so we decided to break it into two parts instead of just one. In the next part, we're going to go over a few other things, including a lot of stuff about bins and metadata. We're going to talk about clip naming and some really, really amazing features, including one of my very, very, very favorite features about clip naming and batch clip naming clips using metadata. We're going to get way deep into the timeline and start dealing with things like tab timelines and stack timelines and things like that, as well as talk a little bit about autosave and recoveries from autosave and things of that nature. So join us for part 2 of this craft editing in DaVinci Resolve webinar.